Welcome to the LowCarbUSA podcast, where we seek to inspire you to help us build this community. I'm Doug Reynolds.
And this is Pam Devine.
Alison Gannett, welcome. It's been a long time since we spoke to you.
I am so glad to be here. I follow you every single day.
Oh, that's brilliant. I'm so glad to hear it. So Alison has spoken at a couple of our events, but one of the things that she has is this personal story. And whenever I speak to her, that song "Burning Down the House" comes to mind. So for a lot of people, I think listening to this one actually have heard that story. So if you wouldn't mind telling us how this happened and how you became aware of lifestyle interventions.
Well, I was a professional extreme skier, organic farmer, and I was traveling around the world having a great time. And I started noticing things getting a little weird. And I thought, oh, I'm 48. I'm just, getting old. Then one day I was actually cooking bacon and it caught on fire and the flames were going up to the ceiling. And my husband walked in the door and said, "Alison, what are you doing?" And I was like, "Oh, it's so pretty." And he was like, "Oh boy." Called a couple nurse friends and said, "We're going to the hospital." And we had been noticing things were off, but watching the house burn down was kind of a new low, I would say. And everybody was very casual at the ER. And then they all of a sudden came back with the CT scan. And basically there was a tumor in my head. We can show pictures if we like of basically almost 2/3 of my brain was filled up with a brain tumor the size of like an orange. And the doctor looked very grim and, I was kind of out of it actually. Don't really remember a lot of this, but long story short is they came back and said, "Oh, you're young, you're healthy, everything's going to be fine." I used Dr. Google to look up what I had. It was a hemangiopericytoma, which is a type of terminal brain cancer that basically starts in the brain and then metastasizes to almost every organ in your body. And the average median lifespan that I found at the time in 2013 was like 6.8 months. And my doctors didn't tell me this. I think it was a blessing in disguise, though, because I ended up finding Dr. Nasha Winters, and she said, "It doesn't matter what your diagnosis is, what type of cancer you have. We are going to look at the root causes of what is making you sick." And that just resonated to me. She put all my labs in a spreadsheet. She looked at my DNA. She looked at my tumor pathology, and we came up with this giant plan to make myself well again. And one of the biggest ways to do that was to reverse insulin resistance. Unbeknownst to myself, as an organic farmer living in rural Colorado, I was growing and raising all my own food. I thought I was really healthy. And I think everybody who's had a low carb epiphany can kind of relate to this experience that we thought we were healthy until we changed our diet and lifestyle. And then we realized how really good we could feel, that there was a whole new level of feeling great. I feel that at 56 right now, I feel better than I did when I was 20. So, I can say thank goodness for cancer. I think it was a blessing and a curse. It hasn't been easy, but I wouldn't trade it for anything right now.
Yeah, very similar experience for me. How much you only realize once you're so much better, you realize how you weren't really that well before, and kind of similar ages as well. So I say the same thing often. I feel I was running ultra marathons and stuff in my early 30s, and I feel better than I did back then. It's amazing. So your business involves helping other people now to get healthy. But something that you told me about recently that you've become more focused on is DNA and how that can come into the equation. And so this is kind of the reason that we got you on here, really, is to hear about that work that you've been doing and what you've learned that maybe can help other people.
I was so obsessed with getting healthy. It became, not about fighting cancer anymore. It was about like becoming the most healthy person I could be. And what was so cool was using science to track my progress. I was using labs, my DNA, my health history to make this like personalized journey away from cancer and towards optimal health. And I got so obsessed with nutrigenomics, which is basically looking at our DNA and figuring out, what we can eat, how we should respond to sleep and stress and hormones and toxins. But today I'm going to talk about my favorite subject, which is what our DNA is telling us about what we can eat, and things like coffee and chocolate. And anyway, let's just dive right into it. The first gene that I like to look at is called CYP1A2. And this gene is all about coffee metabolism. If you have the AA version of this gene, then you are a rapid metabolizer of caffeine, like my husband. He can drink like 20 cups of coffee. I was super worried about him until I got his DNA report back. And then when his DNA report said he was a rapid metabolizer and that coffee would be good for him, I was so relieved, okay, drink as much coffee as you want. Of course, my DNA report came back completely opposite. I am a slow metabolizer of caffeine, so I have to limit my cup to 1/2 cup of decaf and 1/2 cup of regular mixed together in the morning, and that seems to be the perfect for me.
So just let me interrupt you there, because this is very relevant for Pam and I as well. When you say you don't metabolize caffeine, what does that really do? Because an example for us is like, we do half cap, half and half, because she can't take more than that. I can drink 3 cups of full coffee, like literally before I go to bed, and I'll go to sleep like immediately.
Yeah,
and
you're
yet
probably a rapid metabolizer.
Right. If she has coffee afternoon, after the middle of the day, she can't sleep. At 10 o'clock at night, she can't get to sleep. Mm-hmm. It's crazy.
Yeah.
So that's what it means by you don't metabolize it.
That is CYP1A2, but I would also look at another gene that, genes don't exist like on their own. We have millions of them. There's another gene called COMT, which also affects how we metabolize what's called catecholamines. And catecholamines are a polyphenol that is found in coffee. So Pam might be responding either to the caffeine, which it sounds like she definitely is, but I would also look at her COMT gene to see how she's processing catecholamines. Some people cannot process either one, and then coffee's off the table for them altogether. Some people, it sounds like Pam and myself, we can have a little bit, and where Pam might be an intermediate metabolizer of caffeine, or she might be a slow metabolizer of caffeine. What that actually shows in the science is that basically when they take a rapid metabolizer, which is probably yourself, my husband, and they inject them full of caffeine, they process it very quickly into their urine, and it's out of the body very, very quickly. Whereas someone like myself, and maybe Pam as well, it tends to stay in our body for a very, very long time, which is why many of us stop drinking caffeine before noon, because otherwise we're never going to sleep at night. So it's absolutely fascinating. When I got my genetics back for caffeine and I got my husband's, I kind of knew what it might say, but just to have that pat on the back, like, okay, you're not crazy. He can drink 20 cups of coffee and I can only drink a 1/2 cup of coffee. And so, yeah, genes are just so exciting. This is just the field of the future. And the next one that I had to dive in right away was LCT. And this is a gene that shows you whether you can process lactose, which is the prime component in milk. And of all animals, a lot of people separate it out, like I can process sheep milk, but not goat milk, et cetera, et cetera. Lactose is lactose for this particular gene. So if you have the AA version of this gene, it's called the homozygous version, and that means you're lactose tolerant. So that means you're very, very likely to be able to have cheese and cream. If you have the GG version of this, you're very, very likely, it's called the wild type, to be lactose intolerant, which is actually somewhere between the studies show about 65 to 79% of the world is actually lactose intolerant with this wild type. So I, for example, have the wild type and I cannot process lactose, even if I have a small amount. Now you can get around this gene a little bit. Oh, you had a question?
Well, yeah, so I wanted to, you mentioned cheese. Now I know there's some like hard cheeses that—
That's what I was just going to clarify.
Okay, that don't have
Yes.
lactose in. So is that okay for someone who's lactose intolerant?
Yeah, so again, LCT is one gene that is specific to lactose. So if you just have the LCT gene, you can probably have some hard cheeses like aged cheddar that's like 2 years old, Parmesan, the real Parma, for, you know, not covered in glyphosate or chemicals or anything like that.
Right.
The real deal is going to be very, very low in lactose. And you can actually use, you know, Dr. Google to look at cheeses that are low in lactose or dairy items that are low in lactose. But you also have to look at your other genes that affect dairy metabolism and cheese metabolism, because cheese, for example, has a lot of saturated fat in it. So I'm gonna immediately look at your LCT gene, and then I'm gonna go look at your ApoA2 gene. So your ApoA2 gene is gonna tell me if you can process saturated fat or not. So let's say, for example, you had ApoA2 and you had LCT, then cheese might be off the table for you altogether, except for in small amounts. There are a couple other genes that affect saturated fat metabolism, ApoE4, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about. So the studies with ApoE4 are very interesting. Many of the studies, most of the studies, I would say, show that ApoE34 and ApoE44 should tend towards more monounsaturated fats. So that is olive oil, avocado oil, macadamia nut oil, high oleic sunflower oil. You can have a little bit of monounsaturated fats like butter, ghee, lard, tallow. They're about 50% saturated, 50% monounsaturated. But all in all, they're showing that people who have ApoE4 are going to want to stick to more monounsaturated fats. So that's another gene that you're going to look at for fat metabolism. So we've got LCT, we've got ApoA2. Then we're also going to look at another gene called PPAR alpha. And if you have the CC or the wild type of this gene, you're going to have improved saturated fat metabolism. So things that have saturated fat, high saturated fat, are like palm oil, coconut oil. You know, even butter is like 50% saturated, 50% monounsaturated, same with ghee. So if you have that wild type, then you're going to be good to go with saturated fat metabolism, but you have to look at those other genes as well. It's like putting the whole puzzle together. If you have the homozygous version of PPAR alpha, you might have a very, very poor response to saturated fat. A lot of people I know that have this gene actually will eat something like coconut oil or a hunk of cheese, and they will actually vomit. It's a really, really strong gene. Now, I have a lot of genes that don't process saturated fat very well. When my pond was very dirty, when I was very inflamed and, you know, was sick with cancer, I had every morbidity factor known to mankind on my labs. Having another hunk of cheese on there really didn't make a difference. Once I cleaned up my pond, then I actually tried throwing dairy back into that pond, and my genes just said, no way. So it was very, very helpful for me to know which genes I had that affected dairy metabolism, which affected saturated fat, which affected also lactose metabolism. And again, a lot of people focus just on one gene instead of like, you've got to look at all the genes for saturated fat metabolism. If you have one of them, then you could probably have some saturated fat every now and then. If you have 4 of them, you probably will want to get rid of saturated fat altogether. And the other cool thing is you can check your labs to see how it's going. So for example, most people who go on a low carb, high fat diet or therapeutic carbohydrate reduction see their triglycerides drop very sharply because the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is, resolving itself. Some people like myself remain in a high triglyceride state. And so then I immediately look at people's DNA to see what could be causing those high triglycerides. Usually it's one of these genes, ApoA2, PPAR alpha, ApoE4, for example. So then you can kind of figure out how do we mitigate what kind of fats we're eating to help improve the triglyceride numbers on the labs. So I don't ever just look at DNA because DNA expresses itself in your labs. For example, if you had the LCT gene that said you could eat dairy, then I'm going to go look at your labs at a number called IGF-1, insulin growth factor number 1. If it says you can eat dairy on your DNA, but then you look at your labs and your IGF-1 is 200, that means you're eating too much dairy for your body. So just because you have a gene, it can be turned on or turned off. That is the study of epigenetics, which is so fascinating. Back to the genes.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Ahead,
when you say can be turned on or turned off, I mean, is that something you can control, or is it?
Great question. So we consider genetics the genes that you were born with. So that is, they say genes are your loaded gun, and your diet and your lifestyle pull the trigger. So this part, the pulling the trigger, is epigenetics. This part is genetics. So we have genetics over here, epigenetics over here. Epigenetics are basically, I don't need to get too complicated, but you remember the high school biology with the DNA helix. Mm-hmm. We have that helix on, let's say it's here. Then we have what's called these methyl groups that basically either dock, which means they're going to turn on a gene, or they're going to pull away, which means they're going to turn off a gene. And so these methyl groups are coming and going all the time. Say we have a bad night's sleep, then we could be either attaching or removing a methyl group to our DNA. Say I don't have the genetics to process dairy and I have dairy, it could turn on an epigenetic for inflammation, let's say. And so all the time our epigenetics are in flux. And so that's why your genes are not your destiny. They are just your blueprint, and your diet and lifestyle is what is permanently altering your DNA helix on a daily basis. And that's why you and I have seen such amazing changes in our body, right? With changing our diet, changing our lifestyle. For example, you've noticed when you meditate in the morning that you can actually lower your cortisol and lower your insulin response, right? That your glucose goes down. So you are basically turning off a stress gene when you meditate in the morning. Now, if you got up and ran around and had a high stress life, you could turn on a stress gene that is going to affect inflammation in your body. So our diet and our lifestyle, our thoughts affect our blood sugar, our thoughts affect our DNA, and then in turn, our DNA then affects our labs. So it's really cool to like put it all together and see what's actually happening in our body. Because again, just because we have a gene, we have to then check our labs to see if it's expressing itself.
Wow. So If somebody wanted to check out so there's a few things. Yeah, first of all, how would someone go and get these labs? I mean, these companies or whatever that do, like, I forget the names of them now, but something where you can go and find out your heritage or
your
whatever.
ancestry would, like ancestry.com,
right.
or
So
23andMe.
If for instance, do you use a lab or facility like that, or is much more specific than that? How does someone go about trying to get a decent DNA test?
That is a great question. I originally started off with, the ancestry.com and the 23andMe, and that told me mostly like where I was from, which is helpful for, what latitude we come from, UV exposure, immune system response. But I really wanted to dive deeper. So then I went to Alex Swanson, who runs nutritiongenome.com. And his is mostly about nutrigenomics, which is, really how our DNA affects our food choices, our supplement choices, our stress choices. It's very much about those items versus ancestry. Then we also have another one called Stratagene. I'm sure you've heard of Dr. Ben Lynch. He's, super famous in the DNA world. I stalk him and Alex. This is such a new field that most doctors have never even heard about this. And I would recommend the Stratagene is really complex for most people. If you already have gone down the DNA rabbit hole very, very deeply, you might want to consider a program like that. If you're new to this and you want to know, like, how my coffee metabolism is, how's chocolate, how's dairy, I would recommend Nutrition Genome. I think it's the best bang for your buck. It's still kind of complicated. You might want to hire someone like myself to help you sift through it, because a lot of genes can conflict with each other. One gene over here can say you can process vegetable oil, and then this gene over here says vegetable oil will cause inflammation.
Right. Well, that was going to be my next question was, the next part of it was, like, first of all, how do you get it? But then I'm sure that the report doesn't come with major insight. And so that's the kind of thing that you do now, that you that you're able to, people can get hold of you and get you to help them interpret this and understand what it means to them in particular, right? That's
and then combining it with their labs to see if the gene is expressing itself. I find that there are a lot of services out there that are doing just nutrigenomics, but they're not actually looking at the labs. And it really is the marriage of the two together. And then I would even say people's health history is important on top of that. For example, if you see insulin resistance in their DNA and then you see it in their labs, then I would want to look at their health history and see what might be contributing to insulin resistance all the way around. There's a great gene called like TCF7L2. This is a gene that I was very sad to find out that I had, because it basically allows us to process grains and legumes. And this is also a gene that is an issue that is affected by ApoE4. ApoE4 can't process grains and legumes like a normal person. We have massive insulin resistance, which is why a lot of scientists called it like kind of the hunter-gatherer gene. Because if we eat ApoE4 people, if we eat a more low carb diet, ketogenic diet with the right amount of Mediterranean fats, then we live longer than other people. If we have ApoE4 and we eat a standard American diet, we most likely will end up with insulin resistance, diabetes, and Alzheimer's. So it's called the trade-off gene by a lot of scientists, that you can have it go one way or go the other. And I can't tell you how many people are worried about finding out about that gene. I find it an absolute blessing that I got cancer and that I found out that I had this gene. And I also found out that most of my family has 1 or 2 copies of this gene. So we can make changes to live a long, happy life and die of old age. Again, DNA is the loaded gun. Our diet and lifestyle pull the trigger. So it's not your destiny to have Alzheimer's because you have ApoE4, for example.
Yeah, that's the biggest conversation I see in and around the ApoE4 community is about Alzheimer's, because, you know, yeah, even if you get diabetes and you severely, you can reverse that really quickly. But with Alzheimer's, once you start developing those things, you know, from what I've seen, there's maybe you can improve things, but there's no really going back.
Agreed. I mean, you need to catch it early.
So catch it now so that you don't develop those things which you can't now reverse. Whereas, you know, I'm fairly confident in most cases if people are really severe diabetes, we can help them to pretty much reverse that much easier. And there's a very good chance of doing that. Whereas with Alzheimer's, that's not the case. So you need to stop it ahead of, and that's the big thing with the ApoE4 community. It's all about like, okay, I've got this gene. What do I need to do to make sure I don't develop Alzheimer's?
Exactly. And you would want to look at all your other genes that have, you know, relationships.
Correct. Yes.
To ApoE4. So you would really want to look at TCF7L2, which we were just talking about. If you have TCF7L2 ApoE4, you basically probably should never have a grain or a legume ever again. We just look at it and our blood sugar goes up. It's unfortunate, but you know, I've got so many great recipes right now. I don't feel that I miss grains that much. I think in the beginning I did, but now there's so many amazing foods. You know, I've written a whole cookbook about, you know, how you can be grain-free and you can be low carb and high fat and make it taste great. I mean, you post recipes all the time.
Yeah,
I mean, you know what, it doesn't have to be this curse anymore. I kind of consider it a blessing. I can have ice cream and brownies for, you know, and not feel guilty about it because it's actually all the right things for my DNA.
Right. So I think to finish, first of all, I would like you to send me all those different things you mentioned about different types of testing and how people can get them.
Yeah.
But then, and I can put that in the show notes, but then also you can talk about it now and send it to me for the show notes, but tell people if they want to get hold of you so that you can help them to interpret their results. How do they find you?
For sure. My website's alisongannett.com. I'll send you everything. ALISONGANN as in Nancy, ETT as in Tom. And then just click on coaching services and yeah. And,
okay.
You know,
and are you active on social media at all, or is that really the main thing is your website?
I am, you know, I have all the bad genes for the stress response. So I have had to pick and choose my battles, but I am hiring. I have a new person that's running my social media. I'm hiring a whole team. In January, I'm going to open a whole department that all we do is nutrigenomics, which will be like kind of a one and done for people, like a nice, quick, easy way to look at just what they can eat. Based on their DNA versus going through my whole program right now, which is quite extensive. We want to have it like nice and easy for people.
Okay, now this has been fascinating, and I know I've got a huge queue of people, but I've already put you back in that queue to eventually get you back on our stage at one of our events to come and talk about this. I think you've definitely, most of the stuff that you've been working on with regards to DNA and that has been since you spoke the last time for us.
Yeah, so, for sure.
Okay, we need to get you back.
I went down that rabbit hole pretty, I mean, it's just, you know, and we haven't even gotten to like red wine. And then we get to like green tea, like, you know, there's so many of these, it totally makes sense. Like, about the red wine thing, there's like 5 things that are involved with the red wine metabolism. You know, there's vegetable fat metabolism, which we all know is omega-6s anyway, but and then we get, you know, into the stress and the hormones picture is just, oh boy.
Right.
it gets really cool.
No, this is amazingly interesting. Thank you very much for
Fun.
chatting with me now. And yeah, this should be out in about 2 weeks. So
Oh, wow. Cool.
yeah, let's get it out there, and hopefully you get a bunch of people coming to find out about their DNA.
For sure.
You've been listening to an episode of the Low Carb USA podcast. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/lowcarbusa.